This is the Louie Tee Network.
In the lab room.
The views and opinions shared on this program are that of Louie Tee and In the Lab Room alone and should be taken exactly as they are given. If you are soft, easily offended, or can't listen to the criticism of your team, this program is not intended for you. This is pure, unadulterated football talk for the hardcore fan. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome, you are in the lab room. I'm your host, Lou. Thank you for joining me here on this program, 2014 Lab Reports. Today, we're talking about the Miami Dolphins. Let's get it going. 2014 NFL Lab Reports. Miami Dolphins. Strengths for the Miami Dolphins. This Dolphins football team is a team that when I look at them, I'm just stuck in neutral with the Dolphins. Last year, I jumped all over the bandwagon early on in the season. I'm a huge Ryan Tannehill supporter, and I thought they started out the season the way they needed to, jumping out of the gate. And that win against Atlanta, I thought was a defining win for them in terms of them taking that next step to start the season off 3-0, to really give themselves a chance in that division early on. I didn't think the Patriots were as good last year, especially starting the season off. I thought they were vulnerable. And to see the Dolphins start off the way they did, I thought the Dolphins were going to make some noise last year. And then I was just disappointed by this team and their performance and how they lost some games that I thought they should have been able to win. And they had an opportunity to make the postseason, and they kind of just tailed off at the end of the season. And they had so much controversy. For them to even be in the position that they were in at the end of the season speaks volumes as to the mental toughness of this football team, because most teams would have went into the tank following that Jonathan Martin situation, and they were struggling in the season at that time. They had lost to Tampa Bay, who was a winless football team on national television. This team was struggling, but they were able to pull things together and get it back to a situation where they actually had a legitimate shot at making the postseason, but they weren't able to get it done. But there are some things that this team did well a season ago that if they want to try to take that next step and put some more wins up in the standings and get back to the postseason for the first time in about 6 or 7 years, then they're going to need to continue to do these things well. And the first thing that I thought they did an extremely good job at was limiting the penalties. Don't shoot yourself in the foot. And offensive penalties, this Dolphins team, they kept them down to a minimum. Second fewest yards in terms of penalty yards on the offensive side of the football in the National Football League. And that's a way to extend drives. That's a way to give yourself a chance to pick up first downs and get down the field and matriculate the football down the field and get points on the scoreboard. And they had the third fewest amount of penalties on the offensive side of the football. And I talk about this all the time with penalties, because there's nothing worse than scoring a touchdown from 17 yards out on a touchdown strike. You know, if you're the Dolphins, you drive down on a 11-play, 72-yard drive, and on that 12th play, Ryan Tannehill throws a 17-yard strike to Mike Wallace in the end zone, and everybody's excited, you're happy, only to look back and see a flag for holding or a flag for a legal shift, two guys moving at the same time. And all of a sudden, you back up 10 yards, and now you got to kick a field goal, or you back up 5 yards, and then you take a sack. And then on the next play after that, it's third and long, you try a screen, it doesn't go anywhere, and you end up missing a field goal. It's things like that that can change the complexity of a football game. And so when you take that out of the equation and you limit the amount of penalties that you have, you give yourself a chance to win, and you heighten your chances of winning exponentially. Penalties are an easy way to cripple a football team's chances of winning on a game-to-game basis. If you are an undisciplined football team, you will find it harder and harder to win on a weekly basis, because it's hard enough to beat a team week to week in this league. It's hard enough to win a game in the National Football League going up against your opponent. Try doing it when you're also fighting a battle against yourself. And so the Dolphins did a really good job of staying clean and steering clear of penalties on the offensive side of football. And they actually didn't do that bad of a job on the defensive side either. This was a team that wasn't that penalized. And in the defensive category, they kept it down in terms of yards. They had a number of penalties in terms of the amount, but the actual yardage stemming from those penalties was not that great. There weren't a lot of 55-yard pass interference penalties and 37-yard pass interference penalties, because those are the ones that kill you on defense, and the Dolphins did not have a lot of those penalties on the defensive side of the football either. So they did a really good job of being a disciplined football team. Speaking of which, that's a perfect segue into the next strength for this Miami Dolphins football team, and I like to call it passive aggressive. This was a very good pass defense football team last year. You could talk about some of the struggles they may have had stopping the run, but this team got after it when it came to teams trying to pass against them. The Dolphins were one of 6 teams in the National Football League to have more interceptions forced than touchdowns given up. That's a huge accomplishment, because in this league, it's a passing league first and foremost. We all know that. So it's much easier to give up a touchdown through the air and not have an interception per touchdown given up. And that's essentially what the Dolphins did. It was a 1-to-1 ratio, touchdowns to interceptions, and they actually elevated the interception ratio up over the touchdown ratio. So that's a really good accomplishment for a defense in this day and age in the National Football League, where teams are throwing the football all over the place. Now, it doesn't hurt that you play in a division with the Bills and the Jets, 2 teams that were void of passing offenses that scared you. So these teams made it a lot easier on you to go out and get a 3-interception game against Geno Smith, or pick off E.J. Manuel a couple of times, and you had to play them twice. So that didn't hurt. But again, you got to go out and get those things done. You got to go out and force those turnovers, and you got to stop teams from getting in the end zone. And you were able to do that a season ago. So 17 touchdown passes given up, 18 interceptions on the season. That is a huge milestone for a defense. And another thing that the Dolphins did is they got after the quarterback. 42 sacks. This team gets after the quarterback annually. That's something that the Dolphins do very well each and every single year, and they're only going to get better if Cameron Wake can continue to get to the quarterback. And he didn't even have that great of a season last year. He dealt with some injuries. He was banged up. If he can stay healthy, he's a double-digit sack getter. And I think a guy like Deion Jordan, even though he's suspended for the first 4 games of the season, he's coming along. I'm hearing a lot of good things about him out of training camp. Olivier Vernon is playing some good football as well. He's starting to come into his own and starting to maximize his potential in this league. So the Dolphins are getting after teams' quarterbacks, and they did that again last season. That's something that they need to continue to build upon in 2014. And also, they gave up the 6th worst passer rating. So in terms of stopping teams from completing passes and getting touchdowns and picking them off, the Dolphins, their passer rating was down in the 70s at about 77.3. And so when you can keep teams down in their passer rating, you're doing a heck of a job. Again, a lot of teams struggle to keep teams out of the end zone. They struggle with completion percentage. They struggle stopping teams from gashing them through the air. And the Dolphins did a great job of getting after teams, forcing incompletions, forcing turnovers, and they did a great job of not allowing them to get touchdowns via the air. So this Dolphins team did a really good job in the pass defense department a season ago. You go from those strengths to the weaknesses of this Miami Dolphins football team. When you don't make the playoffs in the National Football League, there are going to be some things you struggle with that helped you miss the postseason. And the Dolphins are no different. And so when you talk about the weaknesses of this Miami Dolphins team, you start with field goal inaccuracy. They struggled with the consistency of kicking field goals in 2013. And when you have a rookie kicker, that can sometimes rear its ugly head. And Caleb Sturgis last year struggled at 76% field goal percentage, 4th worst in the National Football League last year. You cannot afford to take points off of the scoreboard if you are a team like the Miami Dolphins that find it hard to score points on a week-to-week basis. This is a team that averaged less than 20 points last season. And you look at all these field goals missed. He missed a total of 8 field goals last year. You can't have that, especially when you're a team that's scoring 17, 19, 21, 22 points in any given game. The defense is only giving up around 20, 21 points. So if you can get that total up over 24, 23 points that you're scoring a game, you're going to win ball games. But when you're missing field goals, and what field goals being missed does, it not only does it take points off of the scoreboard, we know about that, and that's huge in the grand scheme of things. However, it does some other things. It surrenders field position within the game, and it also deflates and demoralizes your football team for the time being. Again, you put together a 9-play, 62-yard drive. You were pinned somewhat deep into your own territory. You were able to drive the football down the field, and you felt like you got some rhythm going. And the one thing you want to do is cap that drive off. It may have not gotten into the end zone, but you want to cap that drive off with points. And when you send your field goal kicker out there and it's a makeable field goal, because sometimes you can send your kicker out there on a whim on a 55-yarder. If he misses that, you can understand. Again, you're surrendering field position when you do that. However, when I send my kicker out there for a 47-yarder, I expect him to pound that field goal home and put 3 points on the scoreboard. And there were times last year where Caleb Sturgis missed field goals that he needed to make. And so this team needs more consistency from the field goal department. And that's a weakness right now that needs to be cleaned up on a football team that doesn't score 34, 33 points a game, that doesn't get up there in the point totals that often. You need every single point you can get. And if you are the Dolphins, that field goal kicking game needs to be more potent. You move on to another weakness for this Dolphins team, and it's running room. And there wasn't a lot of it to be had last season. This Dolphins team did not run the football as effectively as you would have liked to have seen them do it. Lamar Miller's total came down a full yard per carry last year, from right around 5 to right around 4 last year. And this Dolphins team, this offensive line struggled with the injury to Mike Pouncey and a lot of fluctuation around the guard and tackle positions, and you struggling to open up rushing lanes. This team struggled to run the football consistently last year. And if you're going to win and you're going to be a more consistent football team, you're going to be able to put teams away by running the football in your 4-minute offense. If you're going to be able to help take some of that pressure off of Ryan Tannehill, you're going to have to run the football more effectively. And so last year, this Dolphins team, whether it be, early in a football game trying to establish the run to take some of the pressure off the passing game, or late in ball games clinging to a lead, this Dolphins team struggled to run the football. And a lot of it has to be put squarely on the shoulders of the offensive line. They struggled last season. And it was really a mixed bunch of offensive linemen and just a mixed bag of guys out there trying to get it done. It was a ragtag group. And this Dolphins football team is going to go only as far as this offensive line and Ryan Tannehill is going to take them And this offensive line needs to open up holes for this rushing attack to take some of that pressure off of Tannehill and that passing game. And so the Dolphins need to run the football more, and it starts up front with that offensive line. You look at another weakness for this Miami Dolphins football team, and it kind of coincides with what we just talked about with the rushing lanes and them not making room for the running backs. How about protecting the quarterback as well? Last year, the Dolphins were one of the worst teams. No, not one of the worst teams. They were the worst team in the league at protecting their quarterback. Now, it's one thing to allow your quarterback to be hit. It's another thing to give up sacks, and the Dolphins gave up sacks. Now, there's two things you look at, two different elements to a sack. And one is the offensive line not doing their job. And it's not always all the offensive line's fault. We find that out all the time with quarterbacks like Big Ben that like to scramble and extend plays, and the offensive line can only hold up for so long before they break down, protection breaks down, and your quarterback is under duress. But they did their job initially. It's the quarterback's job to get the football out of their hands, and that's the second component in a sack is you can either be beaten off the line as an offensive lineman. That offensive lineman can either be beaten initially and the quarterback never had a chance, or that offensive lineman could have initially done his job. Quarterback goes through his progressions really slow, doesn't get rid of the football, and holds on to it too long, and then the pressure starts to mount and he gets sacked. So there's different components to being sacked, different ways sacks can be accumulated and amassed. However, this Dolphins offensive line, there were times where Tannehill didn't even have a chance on three-step drops last season. I mean, this offensive line did not do a really good job of protecting their prized commodity at the quarterback position. 58 sacks, a league-high 58 sacks surrendered by this Dolphins offensive line. And the next closest team was at 50. So it's not like you were right there on the cusp of, not being the worst. You were the worst, and it wasn't even close. The Jags and their 50 sacks were second. That means you were a full 8 sacks away from the next closest team. So you've got to do a much better job of protecting Ryan Tannehill. And it's amazing that you were able to win as many games as you were with the amount of sacks that you gave up. Because normally sacks turn into turnovers and sacks kill drives. Now, it does make a lot of sense that you didn't score a lot of points last season, because when you get sacked, especially on third down, that can pull you right out of field goal range. And this Dolphins team found it very tough to win some games last season because they were sacked. You think about that Baltimore Ravens game, you trying to come back and steal that game, send it to overtime, and Tannehill gets sacked at the most inopportune time as you lose that football game and watch the seconds tick away. This team has to be better at protecting the quarterback. If you can't protect Ryan Tannehill, you will not win enough games to go to the postseason. End of discussion. You move on to another weakness for this football team, and it's empty cookie jar. This Dolphins football team, they managed to only recover 6 fumbles last season. That was almost the worst in the league. The reason why they were only able to recover 6 fumbles is because they were second to last in the league at forcing fumbles. And so when you don't force fumbles, you can't recover something that you don't cause in the first place. So if you're the Dolphins, you've got to find a way to get that football out of there. And that's part of the reason why your turnover differential, your plus minus, was -2 last year, because you didn't generate enough turnovers via fumbles. And for a team that gets to the quarterback as often as this Dolphins team did, you had 42 sacks a season ago, you got to get the quarterback and get the football out at the same time. You got to go for that strip sack fumble. And so you've got to be better in that regard if you're the Dolphins at getting the football out, because you got to either force receivers to fumble or running backs to fumble or the quarterback to fumble. You've got to find a way to get that football out and on the carpet And then the second component to having the fumbles go in your direction is you got to recover them. You can force all the fumbles you like, but you got to recover them to make it count. However, if you don't force the fumble in the first place, you can't recover it. So Dolphins need to be more aggressive when it comes to sticking their hand in the cookie jar and coming out with some cookies. Right now, you're sticking your hand in the cookie jar and there's no cookies to be had. And you've got to find a way to stick your hand in the cookie jar and not get slapped on the wrist. You've got to stick your hand in that cookie jar and come out with the football and get those cookies. Yum, yum, eat them up. And last year, you did not do a good enough job of poking the football free and recovering it. And that's part of helping your offense out, is generating turnovers and giving them shorter fields, taking the football away from the opposition and limiting their opportunities to put points up on the scoreboard, all the while giving your offense a better opportunity to score the football. And so Dolphins need to be better at generating turnovers on fumbles and recovering those fumbles. So you go from those weaknesses to, of course, camp battles for this Miami Dolphins football team. So as you can see behind me, I have my big board to break down these camp battles of the Miami Dolphins, as well as their experiment a little bit later on. So we start with the camp battles for this Dolphins football team. And this Dolphins camp is so convoluted. These positional battles are so convoluted because there's so many extenuating circumstances affecting these positions. Let's talk about some of these camp battles. And you start with the running back position. I talked about the Dolphins' struggles running the football. Half of it was the offensive line. The other half was the running back. So they looked to address that position somewhat very subtly. They didn't go out and go get a high-priced free agent. They didn't go out and address it through the draft. They said, hey, we'll go out and get a guy that produced last year in Knowshon Moreno in Denver. The knock on him is, did he have a breakout season because of the success of the passing game and Peyton Manning in Denver, or is this guy just a tough, physical, in-between-the-tackles runner that can also catch the football? That's the question. Well, right now the Dolphins don't know the answer to that because he hasn't been healthy. Had some injuries lingering from the season before, elected to have surgery. Hasn't been on the field since those surgeries. He's not healing fast enough. I don't think he's going to necessarily be cut from this roster, even if he doesn't play all preseason long. I just think that it makes the Dolphins' decisions at the running back position a little bit tougher. So you look at the running back position, 5 for 4 or potentially 3. And the question is, are they satisfied with their running back position enough to only keep 3? Or is Knowshon Moreno's injury going to force them to keep an extra back on hand initially? And we'll talk about why that's important a little bit later. But Knowshon Moreno, Lamar Miller, Daniel Thomas, Mike Gillespie, and Damian Williams are your 5 running backs. Now, I think there's only going to be enough space for 3 of them. And here's why. You might initially be able to keep 4 running backs because Deion Jordan will not count against your 53-man roster early on because of his suspension. But at some point, after those 4 games are up and you have a bye week somewhere early in the season, maybe week 6 or week 5, but either way, he's going to be back after that 4-game suspension. Somebody has to be removed from the roster so that he can be counted onto the 53-man roster. So will it be an extra running back that is slashed? Will it be an extra tight end that is slashed? I don't know. But that's a question that you got to ask yourself if you're the Dolphins. Knowshon Moreno's injury makes it a little tougher as well because maybe you keep an extra back early on because he's banged up. Maybe you say, hey, we don't want to keep an extra back on this team. We'll just roll with 3 even if he's not ready to go. So there's some questions to be asked. But Knowshon Moreno, only on a 1-year deal, so he's going to make this roster. Lamar Miller, he's not going anywhere either. He's going to be your feature back. So those two are guaranteed roster spots. You go over here, though, 3 for 2 or 1. If they keep 4 backs, then you're going to have 2 guys out of this mix over here. If they're going to keep 1 back, then you're going to have only 1 guy out of this mix. And it's Daniel Thomas, Mike Gillespie, and Damian Williams. Daniel Thomas is a guy out of K-State that's been with you for a while. He's disappointing, then he's good, then he's disappointing again. The inconsistency is what kills you with Daniel Thomas. Mike Gillespie, a kid out of Florida, got a little bit of speed, but he's okay, but he's not a guy that wows you with his ability, so you feel like you can do a little bit better than him. He might make this roster. He may not make this roster. And a guy that's been surprising people in camp is Damian Williams, a kid out of Oklahoma, undrafted rookie free agent, coming in, turning some heads, doing some things in camp. He has a outside shot of making this roster. He's been performing well in camp. We'll see if he continues to perform well enough to have his name remain on this list when it's all said and done at the end of the preseason. So that's an interesting battle to look at. They're either going to keep 3 or 4 running backs, and it's all going to depend on how these guys produce in training camp and how Noshawn Moreno's health is going to be able to hold up for the duration of this season. And so you move on to the wide receiver position, and this is another one of these convoluted positions where you see a lot of guys, and the Dolphins are probably going to keep 6 receivers, especially with all the injuries they had a season ago to a guy like Brandon Gibson, and Mike Wallace didn't perform the way you thought he was going to. They're going to keep some guys around, and so it'll be interesting to see how this list shakes out. But we're going to talk about 9 for 6. 9 players for 6 roster spots. Mike Wallace, Brian Hartline, Brandon Gibson, Jarvis Landry, Rashard Matthews, Damian Williams, Armand Benz, Matt Hazel, and Marcus Thigpen has now been relegated back to wide receiver duties. His distinction is now at receiver once again. And so we'll talk about him when we get to him in a second. And just so you know, there are 2 Damian Williams on this roster. One with an E as a running back, one with an A as a receiver. So don't be confused by the 2. So automatically, Mike Wallace, Brian Hartline, Brandon Gibson, and Jarvis Landry are all making this roster. Wallace and Hartline are going to be your starters. I thought you started to struggle offensively when Brandon Gibson went down. I thought he was starting to emerge as a very reliable target for Ryan Tannehill last year. And when he went down with an injury, you started to see this offense bog down a little bit, especially in the red zone. So he's going to be back. Good to see him healthy and out there being productive again. And Jarvis Landry has been the show stealer of camp thus far. Very impressive. And I think everybody expected that when he was drafted out of LSU. This kid did everything at LSU. He blocked. He caught the football. He runs better than people give him credit for. I think his 40 times scared a lot of people away at the combine. But make no mistake about it, the kid is a football player. And you found that out so far at camp and into the preseason. I think he's going to be the guy that catches your eye the most with this receiving group. But you go from the guys that are going to make the roster to these other guys over here, these other 5 players, 5 for 2. I think it's a 5 for 2 race. And I really feel like Rashard Matthews is going to make this roster. I really wanted to put him over here with the guys that were locks, but he's not a lock quite yet. But I feel like of all these guys over here, he's proven himself a little bit, and I think there's still some ceiling to tap into with Rashard Matthews. I thought he played okay last year in the absence of Brandon Gibson. He got a lot of looks last year, and I thought he performed well at times. And I think he's going to be back on this roster. You're going to want to see more growth out of him this season. So I expect Rashard Matthews to make this roster. And he's been playing really well in camp as well. So I think he'll be around. Damian Williams is a kid out of Tennessee. Has been in this league for a little while. Was returning kicks for the Titans last year. And if he makes this roster, then Marcus Thigpen will not make this roster. And Marcus Thigpen, to me, is a guy that has potential to be an explosive return man in this league. But that can't be the only thing that he does because he's not on the field that often as a receiver. And because this receiving core is so deep, if he's not producing as a receiver and he's not being a standout on special teams, he can't just make the roster as a returns guy. He's going to have a lot of value, whether it's special teams return units, special teams coverage units, and he's got to produce in some form or capacity as a receiver. I just don't know if he'll be able to do enough to make this roster. Matt Hazel is a kid you drafted out of Coastal Carolina. He's someone that is practice squad eligible, so even if he doesn't make the roster, he'll probably end up on your practice squad. Armand Benz is a guy that has been around the league, was in Cincinnati, drafted out of Cincinnati, went to the Cincinnati Bengals, came over to Miami last year, was looking like a surefire bet to make this roster, and then he hurt himself towards ACL, missed the entire season, and the Dolphins got rid of him. So I'm thinking to myself, he's got a shot to make this roster as well, and he has something that this roster currently lacks in legitimate size at around 6'3". So every single one of these guys brings something different to the table. I think two of these guys are going to make this roster, and I think it's going to be Rashard Matthews and either Benz, Williams, or Thigpen, I think are going to snag that 6th and final roster spot at wide receiver for this Dolphins football team. You move on to the biggest question mark on this Dolphins football team, and that is the offensive line. This thing is in flux right now, and there are players moving around everywhere. One thing's for certain. With the injury to Mike Pouncey and him not healing as fast as everyone assumed he would, and him probably going to miss the first 6 or 7 games of the season, he's going to end up probably on that PUP list. And with him being out, I think the Dolphins are going to have 5 brand new starters along that offensive line to start the season off in 2014. And so I've got the starters here that are listed, that the Dolphins recently had a inter-squad scrimmage, and these were the guys that started. And I think this is going to ultimately be your starting lineup come preseason game number 1, barring any injuries. And if guys perform well, this might be your day 1 starting unit for this offensive line. And it's not that bad of a group, but I'll talk about one position in particular that has struggled throughout camp and that you really need to have someone step up in the absence of Pouncey here in a second. But Brandon Albert, Darren College, Nate Garner, Dallas Thomas, and Jawan James. Now, your tackle position is basically set and etched in stone, barring injury. Albert, a guy that you went after in free agency, your big fish free agent acquisition, is starting at left tackle. And Jawan James, your first-round pick out of Tennessee, is going to man it up at right tackle. So your tackle situation is basically set. Where you have to figure out who is the right man for the job is from guard to guard. And Darren College is a guy that you signed in free agency, that's been around the league, been in Arizona, spent a lot of time in Green Bay. That's where he made his name a household name in this league. And so he's a veteran that you trust, and I think it's pretty safe to say he'll be your left guard starting week 1, barring injury. So I think that's another position that's been locked up on this line. Now, center and right guard are your 2 question marks. And Dallas Thomas is a kid that you drafted out of Tennessee about 2 years ago as a tackle, moved him over to guard, and he struggled somewhat early on in his career, but he's come into shape to camp, and he's looked good. He's been with the ones throughout mini camp and into training camp. And so I think the Dolphins like what they've seen out of Dallas Thomas thus far, and he's going to remain your right guard. So that's 4 out of the 5 positions solidified on this offensive line if nothing were to change. This is the position that scares you right now, center, because you don't really have a guy that has differentiated himself and separated himself from the rest of the group. There's been a lot of mistakes, a lot of bad snaps in practices, and a lot of guys not getting it done. Nate, and the part about it that's frustrating for the Dolphins is that a lot of these guys aren't naturally centers. They're naturally guards, and you're forcing the issue because of the injury to Mike Pouncey. And so right now, Nate Garner has been getting the most looks at center, but he's not a natural center either. He's more of a guard that can play center. And you look over here at this list, of centers that you have. And you rarely see a team have about 4 or 5 different guys playing center, but that's how bad it's been for you thus far in camp. David Arkin, a guy that was with the Cowboys before, has been in Miami. He's very inconsistent yet very young. So he's a guy that has struggled in camp with snaps and ball hitting the ground. Another guy, Shelly Smith, coming over from the St. Louis Rams and the Houston Texans, coming over to your organization. You've gave him a look thus far. He's had trouble with snaps as well. He's struggled a bit. And then Sam Brenner was a guy that you actually, in the injury to Mike Pouncey, gave him an opportunity to see the field last year. He played okay, but again, you're looking to upgrade that position. Mike Pouncey has to come back and be healthy to solidify this offensive line. I think Nate Garner might actually be your best option along this offensive line at the center position. It'll be interesting to see throughout camp and in the preseason who is running with the ones consistently, because they've been moving these guys around. One day it's one guy, the next day it's another guy. So you really don't know who's going to be your center, but that's definitely a position that needs to be stabilized on this football team. And you're not asking for a guy to start 16 games. You're just asking for someone to hold it down until Pouncey can get healthy and get back onto the football field. And so this offensive line for the Dolphins is going to be one to keep an eye on, because, again, we talked about the struggles of this offensive line a season ago, and you need to find some kind of cohesion, some kind of unit that you can gel together and have them stand up and protect Ryan Tannehill and open up some holes in the running game. You move on to the tight end position. This is a question mark as well. I have it up here as 5 players for 4 positions. Dolphins are actually talking about potentially keeping 5 tight ends, that they're so impressed with the group thus far. Some of these guys have been unimpressive, however, but you don't want to give up on them too soon. You look at this group: Charles Clay, Michael Agnew, Arthur Lynch, Deion Sims, and a guy that has come out of nowhere, Harold Gator Haskins. And so Charles Clay is on this roster. His versatility, his ability to catch the football, to split this guy out wide, have him line up tight, to put him in the backfield as an H-back or a fullback. He's too multifaceted and too important to this offense to not be on this team. You can forget about him going anywhere. Arthur Lynch, kid you drafted out of Georgia in the 5th round. I think it's pretty safe to say his ability to block and be a inline wide tight end is going to keep him around. He's not going anywhere either. So those are 2 guys that you know are going to be around. I think Deion Sims is an interesting prospect out of Michigan State. He's really big at about 6'6", 6'7". And so I think him being a second-year player, I don't think he's going anywhere either. So that's 3 tight ends. Michael Agnew, for me, is the guy to watch, because he's been disappointing. We remember him from the Hard Knocks series and how they used to chew him out all the time in the meetings. And I thought last year he played a lot better. Showed some versatility. They actually put him at fullback a little bit. Showed the ability to catch the football at both tight end and fullback and block a little bit better too. So I think he has to continue to improve. He has not stood out in camp, however. And so a guy like Harold Gator Haskins has shown some flashes of potential in camp, has stood out at times. And so he's had his stock rise throughout camp. And so it would not surprise me if the Dolphins kept 5 tight ends. The reporters have asked head coach Joe Philbin if that would be a possibility. And he said, hey, anything's possible. So Haskins, to me, has to continue to prove that he's better than someone else, because I don't see the Dolphins keeping 5 tight ends. I don't think that's a luxury that they currently have. They can use that roster spot to fill a void somewhere else. They don't need to spend it on having an extra tight end. So I think it's going to be 4 tight ends. And I think the 2 that are going to be battling for that final position is going to be Michael Agnew and Harold Gator Haskins. And so we'll see who's able to win that last roster spot, because I just don't see the Dolphins keeping 5 tight ends. So you move on to another position, and this is a big one. Dolphins are doing a little bit of shuffling along the linebacking core. And so outside linebackers up for grabs. Philip Wheeler, a guy that you went after in free agency aggressively last year from the Oakland Raiders, is up against Jelani Jenkins, a kid that you drafted out of Florida a year ago. And so he's starting to grasp the defense and he's starting to run around freely. He's not thinking as much. He's reacting and being proactive. And so Jelani Jenkins, to me, is the quintessential strong side linebacker. Philip Wheeler, to me, is a guy that struggled last year. And the Dolphins are not only shuffling potentially his position around, but they're experimenting with Koamisi moving inside to middle linebacker and L.A.B moving outside to weak side linebacker. So Dolphins tinkering with some things at the linebacker position. They did not get the production out of that group last year that they were expecting to get when they spent all of that money. So Philip Wheeler is a guy that could easily see his time as a starter and his snaps in general be diminished. And his role on his team could be reduced to just a situational pass rusher. So it'll be interesting to see if he can hold off Jelani Jenkins. To me, it's not a matter of if this kid, Jelani Jenkins, is going to get a chance to start. It's when. He may not be the day one starter, but at some point, he is going to start at outside linebacker for the Miami Dolphins this season. You move on to kicker. And there's not necessarily a huge battle here, but because he struggled a season ago, did Caleb Sturgis, he's got to fend off random guys that the Dolphins are going to bring in. And the Dolphins are going to just bring in random legs to see if he's going to be able to handle the pressure of other guys kicking against him in camp. And so it's Caleb Sturgis versus the world. The world, Caleb. And I think he'll be your kicker. You don't draft kickers and then release them. He would have had to have had a meltdown last year for him not to be back as the Dolphins kicker. He's got to be better, however. If he has another season where he misses 8 or 9 kicks and costs the Dolphins a game or two, he won't be around next year. There will be no next year for Caleb Sturgis, but he's going to get another opportunity to right the ship. And you know what's crazy is you watch this kid struggle, and Dan Carpenter is out there lighting it up for the Buffalo Bills. And I know you don't want to have any regrets, but man, I never understood why you let go of Dan Carpenter in the first place. That's just me. So we go from camp battles to the experiment, and I've dubbed this experiment fins up or down. So you go on to the experiment, fins up or down. And I'm not really sure. This team, I'm lukewarm on them because at one point you think they're getting it, you think they're going in the right direction, and then some things happen and they struggle and they don't beat teams that you're expecting them to beat. And so I need them to be more consistent. Let's go into the research question. Will all the changes to the staff and offensive line help the maturation of Ryan Tannehill? And can this defense strengthen enough to make the Dolphins serious AFC East competitors? Look, we all know that in this division, the New England Patriots are the king. And in order for you to be the king of the hill, you got to slay the dragon. And that dragon is the New England Patriots. And nobody's been able to take them down. And it's not going to be one team. It's got to be a collective effort. And everybody's got to do their part. Teams within this division are going to have to find a way to beat the Patriots at least once. And you can't worry about what anybody else is doing. If you're the Dolphins, all you can do is take care of your own business. And you've got some changes, new offensive coordinator. Things have been shaken up within this organization in terms of the coaching staff. And some guys got fired, including a guy that Ryan Tannehill was very familiar with, and Mike Sherman, his ex-head coach in college. And so it's a new offensive playbook. It's a lot of changes. Offensive line has been shaken up a little bit. And so are all those changes going to be enough to make this Dolphins football team a legit competitor in the AFC East division? We will see. Only time will tell. The hypothesis: if Ryan Tannehill is protected and continues to grow in a new offensive scheme, and the running game and defense improve greatly, then the Miami Dolphins can challenge in the AFC East. And that's what it's all about. Is can Ryan Tannehill, who I thought played well last year, he improved in every statistical category there was last season from his rookie year. However, there is still a lot of room for growth and maturation. And this is the thing that scares me about this upcoming season, is that I just talked about new offensive coordinator Bill Lazor and his offense coming into the fold, and now it's all new terminology, and you're changing some of the things that Tannehill was comfortable with. Keep in mind, Tannehill had been basically in the same offense since college. So he was familiar with everything, and he had played in that system for the last 2 years in the NFL, and now you're changing all of that. Does he take a step backwards because of the change in offensive coordinator? I've seen some really solid quarterbacks in this league be hampered by constant change at the offensive coordinator coaching spot. I've seen some quarterbacks have 5 offensive coordinators in 5 years. I've seen quarterbacks have 4 offensive coordinators in 5 years, and it really takes a toll on them mentally because they're not able to just go out and go through progressions and reads and make plays. They've got to think about what they're supposed to be doing. They got to think about where guys are going to be because the terminology has changed and guys are running different routes and concepts have changed. So this is going to be a big season for Ryan Tannehill, I think, because if the Dolphins don't play well enough, Philbin was on the hot seat last year after the whole Jonathan Martin fiasco. He was on a hot seat, and guys had to go, and that's why Mike Sherman is no longer here. Guys had to go. And if they don't get it done this year, and let's just go with the assumption that the Dolphins don't take care of business and Philbin is fired, what do you think is going to happen to the offensive coordinator? He's not going to be around. Bill Lazor is going to be gone. New head coaches coming in, new offensive coordinators coming in, and that will be Tannehill's 3rd offensive coordinator in 4 years. So I'm not saying, I'm just saying Dolphins really need to play some good football this season. We move on to materials needed. Up the Tannehill. And so this can mean a number of things. I want to see Ryan Tannehill continue to up his play, up his stock in the National Football League. I thought he played better last year. Again, in every statistical category, he was better. And so I want to see him continue to grow. I want to see the completion percentage heighten. I want to see the touchdowns went way up. So did the interceptions. Now I need to see the interceptions go down, and I want to see the touchdowns continue to elevate. The passing yards went way up. I want to see that continue to grow. I want to see him continue to mature as a quarterback, and I want to see him get rid of the football, take less sacks. I want to see him be smarter as a football player, and I want to see this team go up, and I want to see him be upright. Up the Tannehill. I want to see him be upright as a quarterback and not be sacked. So this offensive line needs to protect him. So there's a lot of different factors that go into up the Tannehill. But I tell you one thing's for sure. This Dolphins team will only go as far as Ryan Tannehill takes them. And so he needs to be upright, getting rid of the football and playing really good football at the quarterback position for this team to take that next monumental step in the AFC East. Laser-like focus. Just talked about Bill Lazor, your new offensive coordinator coming in. And this offense, and he needs to have a laser-like focus, does Bill Lazor. He needs to come in and get a really good feel for this Dolphins football team. Have a really good pulse of what this team needs in game-to-game situations. Last year, at times, I thought this Dolphins offense failed to take care of business from the coaching standpoint as well as the player standpoint in certain game situations. They failed to call the right plays. They failed to put players in the right positions, and the players failed to make plays when it was in crunch time, and it cost the Dolphins some games last year. And so Bill Lazor needs to come in and not only make sure that he puts some of these talented guys like Mike Wallace and Brian Hartline and Jarvis Landry in the right positions for these guys to make plays, but he also needs to make sure he finds a good balance between pass and run and putting his team in positions to succeed. And then the players, they need to make sure that they focus in on the task at hand. This is a new offensive scheme for everyone involved, so there needs to be a laser-like focus on the task at hand on the offensive side of the football. You move on to the next material needed. Miller time. Lamar Miller has to step up. He's got all the talent in the world, all the speed to burn, some moves, everything you're looking for at the running back position, except consistent production. And I think this is the season where he needs to break out. If the offensive line is improved, and I don't think they can be any worse than they were a season ago, with Brendan Albert and Jawan James manning up the tackle positions, if Darren College and Dallas Thomas can come in and solidify the guards, Mike Pouncey will be back at some point. This offensive line is going to be much improved. He has to be able to take that next step as a running back. The Dolphins need more consistent production out of their backs. And it starts with Lamar Miller. He's the guy that's going to take this running game and this rushing attack to the next level. He's the one with the most talent on this football team in terms of the running backs. He's got to play better. It has to be Miller time in 2014. You move on to the next material needed. Better beef. And I just talked about the offensive line. I expect the beef up front to be much better. I talked about Brendan Albert, a guy you got from Kansas City. He's a legit left tackle in this league. Jawan James, a guy you drafted in the first round out of Tennessee. You expect him to anchor the right side. Darren College, a veteran that's been in this league that can get it done. Left guard. Dallas Thomas has to prove himself. This is his opportunity to prove that he belongs not only on this Dolphins football team, but in this league. He's going to get an opportunity at right guard. And if Pouncey comes back healthy at center, this is a really competent offensive line. They've got to get it done. It's got to be better beef up front, protecting Tannehill and opening up rush lanes for the running backs in Miami. You go on to money well spent. You spent a lot of money last year in the offseason. You spent some money this year in the offseason. It's time for you to see the dividends of the money you spent over the last 2 years. I'm talking about Mike Wallace. I'm talking about the linebackers in L.A.B. And you see that we talked about Wheeler potentially losing his position. Well, he's going to have to prove his worth elsewhere, whether it be special teams, getting after the quarterback as a situational pass rusher, or just playing better at linebacker this year and solidifying his spot. Whatever the case may be, he needs to prove his worth. You spent money on Brendan Albert. He needs to come in and be a rock at left tackle. How about Earl Mitchell? You went out and spent money on him. I think the world of Earl Mitchell at the defensive tackle position. He has to come in and play some football. You went out and got Louis Delmas. What about O'Shawn Moreno? All this money spent. It's time for this money that you have been spending over the last 2 years to prove to be good money spent. Money well spent. Time for guys to start to provide dividends for the money that the Dolphins have spent over the last couple of years in free agency. You move on to the last material needed. Win, Finn, Philbin. Joe Philbin has to win. Dolphins have to win this year. He's not getting another opportunity if the Dolphins don't somehow find a way to sneak into the postseason. And look, this AFC conference as a whole is not that strong. Last year you had a chance to get to the postseason, you blew it. You're going to have an opportunity this year. If you can find a way to win 1 or 2 games that you don't have any business winning, win the games that you're supposed to win, you're going to find yourself in a very good position to make it to the postseason this year. But if you drop some games like at home to the Jets or at home to the Bills, if you drop some games that you're supposed to win, if the Jaguars are struggling and you lose to them in Jacksonville, you're not making the postseason this year. You're not. You're going to have to find a way to beat a team or two that you have no business beating. Maybe a Green Bay at home. Maybe you need to go on the road and beat a Chicago or Detroit. Whatever the case may be, you've got to find a way to win some games this year and find a way into the postseason. If not, I don't know if Joe Philbin will be back. I don't know if 8-8, 9-7, but another year out of the postseason is going to save his job. Maybe 9-7 might, even if you don't make the postseason. But 8-8, 7-9, I don't think it's going to cut it. And I think you're going to be looking for a new head coach if he isn't able to win in 2014. So you go to the independent variable, offensive growth. This offensive line has to produce better. Ryan Tannehill has to continue to grow. It's a new offense. They've got to score more points, though. Last year, they averaged just a shade under 20 points per game. That's got to be upped to well over 20, 22, 23 points a game. This defense was only giving up 20 points a game last year. So if you can score 23 points with the way your defense was stingy last year, if they could continue to play football and you went out and got Cortland Finnegan in free agency and you're hoping some of these younger guys can step up their games and help you provide some depth at the cornerback position. We'll see, because again, this is a Dolphins football team that defensively didn't give it up last year that often. It was just the offense wasn't scoring a lot of points, and so you were put in positions where you didn't do enough to win. So if you're the Dolphins, offensive growth is going to be important to help this team along in 2014. You go from there to the dependent variable, and that's defensive consistency. And if the offense can grow and put points up on the scoreboard, then this defense needs to continue to be consistent. Get after the quarterback. You have to force more turnovers than you did a season ago. And keep teams down like you did last year. Just be consistent. Whatever you do as a defense, be consistent at it. If you're going to get after the quarterback, be consistent. If you're going to force turnovers, be consistent. If you're going to hold teams down to 17, to 19, to 20, to 22 points a game, be consistent in that for the defense. You need to be able to keep teams down because, again, we don't know how good this offense will be in Miami this season. So it's imperative that this defense is consistent and consistently holding teams down and making sure that this Dolphins offense has enough time to grow and score points. This defense is going to have to keep the Dolphins, much like they did last year, in football games so that this offense can come around and help them win football games. You move on to the constant. Quarterback sacks. If there's one thing that this Dolphins team does well each and every single year, it's get after the quarterback. You can say what you want about the run defense, and you can say what you want about them being inconsistent in different areas. And yeah, the tackling was spotty last year. You struggled at the linebacker position last season. You dealt with injuries along your defensive line last year. But you say what you want about this defense. Don't talk about them not getting pressure on the quarterback. Because annually, the Dolphins have up over 40 sacks on the season. They do it just about every year. The last 5 or 6 seasons, there's only been one occurrence when the Dolphins didn't have over 40 sacks or at 40 or over 40 sacks. And that was only one time, and that was 39 sacks. So the Dolphins consistently get pressure. And with Olivier Vernon and Cameron Wake, and you're hoping the emergence of Deion Jordan and adding a guy like Earl Mitchell to the fold, you're expecting to get after the quarterback again in 2014. And that has been something that has been consistent, and that goes all the way back to the days of Jason Taylor getting sacks on the quarterback in Miami. So we end up at the conclusion. What does this all mean for the Miami Dolphins? And I look at this football team and all of the different things that they have going on, and Ryan Tannehill and his maturation and progression and a new offensive scheme. And is this defense going to get to where you need them to be to help this team win consistently in 2014? And is the coaching staff going to do a good enough job of making in-game adjustments and putting this team in positions to win? There's a lot of questions to be asked in Miami, and the schedule isn't that tough. It really isn't. There isn't a stretch of football where you say, wow, that's a tough stretch. Dolphins are really going to have to strap it up there. There's a lot of winnable games on this schedule. And like I said, if the Dolphins are going to take that next step, it starts in week 1, home for New England. You got to do your part. If you want to be taken seriously in this division, in the AFC conference, you have to beat the Patriots. And especially at home. You did it last year. You need to do it again week 1. That's an important football game. That'll tell a lot about where this Dolphins team is as a football team. And you really can't say, I know a team in week 1. But I definitely can say, I will know what this Dolphins team will be about after week 1. Because if they're serious about competing, they'll beat the Patriots in week 1. And that'll go a long way in terms of them being a team that will vie for a playoff spot moving down the road. If they can win in week 1, I think that's a huge game right out of the gate. And so I have this Dolphins team right now at 8-8. And I wrestled back and forth between 9-7 and 8-8. But at the end of the day, I still am not sold on this Dolphins team knowing how to win the close games consistently. There were a lot of close football games last year. And then there were some stinkers in there. You know, there was that Buffalo game last year where they had a backup quarterback come in and you turned it over and you lost the football game. There was the Jets game at the end of the season. There were the struggles at the end of the season, period, where you were in the driver's seat and you go to Buffalo and you lay an egg. You get basically shut out. You don't play well. Those are the games that scare me, and I can't forget those. And I know it's a new season, but until you prove to me that you're more consistent on the offensive side of football and that you can get after teams and force the issue consistently defensively, and this offensive line is just better and the running game is better, I just don't know. So 8-8 is the best I could do for this Dolphins football team. That's not going to be enough to get to the postseason this year either. 9-7 might be enough. 8-8 will not be. So we'll see what the Dolphins are able to do. I've got them at 8-8 this season. And so that's going to do it for the Miami Dolphins and their lab reports. I thank you for joining me. If it happens in the National Football League, whether big or small, we cover it all here in the lab room. I thank you for joining me. Come back and join me tomorrow when we'll be talking about the next team up on the docket, the Baltimore Ravens. See you next time. Have a good one. Like the content? Want more? Sub up.